Well, we are in an enormously difficult environment right now, macroeconomically, and that is true almost everywhere in the world. The crisis is severe and likely to get worse in the short term. The reason is we are battling a number of major disruptions, almost all of them human-caused rather than natural, but nonetheless very difficult and deep disruptions that are continuing to afflict the world economy. And because of the lack of diplomacy, as you mentioned, a theme of my talk, we don't have cooperation to solve these deep problems right now at the global scene. I would say to my friends in Argentina, because Argentina is an important member of the G20, which will meet in November, that is an occasion for Argentina and for other countries to insist that the big powers, the United States, China, Russia, and others, work together to overcome the current crises, because all the rest of the world right now is being profoundly endangered and disrupted by the conflicts among the major countries. We face multiple shocks. This is quite obvious. We face the continuing shocks of the COVID pandemic, which disrupted the entire world economy, deepened the crisis, especially in developing countries, and disrupted global supply chains in a way that continues until today. We know that recovery from the pandemic was incomplete, and especially that the developing countries were lagging behind because the wealthier countries used strong fiscal and monetary stimulus to bounce back from the sharp decline of 2020. But of course, developing countries could not do that. Argentina has no fiscal space at all, obviously, but Argentina is not alone in that. All through the world, other than in Europe, the United States, and a few other countries, the recovery from COVID was actually almost non-existent, not just incomplete. Then came the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has been a profoundly disruptive factor, and a very dangerous one militarily, as well as profoundly disruptive economically. Of course, a lot of people are being killed in Ukraine on both sides, but even more ominously, the war continues to escalate, and there is even talk by many countries of the risks of nuclear war as a result of this conflict. And this is extraordinarily dangerous. We have not heard talk like this for 60 years, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which has its 60th anniversary this very month, because the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in October 1962. When the war broke out in February 24th, the Western countries imposed very heavy sanctions on Russia, with the attempt to use economic means to stop Russia's war abilities. Predictably, this failed because Russia was able to reorient a significant amount of its trade in oil to Asia, away from Europe. But what is quite striking is that the sanctions had a major adverse effect on Europe, a boomerang effect, which put Europe into a recession which is becoming extremely deep. As the war escalated, Russia cut off the flows of gas to Western Europe. And this deepened the crisis in Europe because Europe could not conceivably replace the gas by other international means. Oil, yes, but not gas, because gas comes in pipelines, gas requires heavy infrastructure, and gas cannot simply be reoriented. And so the result was a major supply shock to Europe, first and foremost, but also, of course, to developing countries around the world that suffered a significant increase of food prices, fertilizer prices, and oil and gas prices. So now Europe in a very deep recession, and the United States are probably in recession as well. Now, those supply shocks, which were very serious, both from COVID, the war, and the sanctions, meant that we entered a period of stagflation. This is the first worldwide stagflation in 40 years. It brings back a lot of memories for me because I began my economics career 42 years ago as an assistant professor at Harvard. My dissertation in 1980 was on the supply shocks of the 1970s, and my first published book in 1982 was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation. We have a similar constellation of events now as we did in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And one can recall in Argentina, those were not easy years in Argentina in the early 1980s economically. Of course, they were years of hyperinflation, in fact. Now, the reason why the stagflation is so powerful right now is twofold. On the one side, the supply shocks are very strong. On the other side, the monetary stimulus that the Federal Reserve applied after March 2020 was the strongest in our history. The Central Bank of Argentina could only dream of getting away with a monetary expansion like the one the Fed used. The Fed essentially printed $3 trillion of base money. $3 trillion. If Argentina did 1,000th of that, it gets into trouble. But the Fed produced, through massive open market operations that were buying the bonds sold by the Treasury to fund unprecedented budget deficits, increased base money spectacularly. And it was very interesting from a monetary theory point of view. The first effects were only in the asset markets. So the first effects of this huge monetary expansion were a booming stock market. The rich got richer than ever before. Also, other commodities boomed. One evidence of the remarkable monetary expansion was the boom of cryptocurrencies, which in my view have zero fundamental value and zero social value as well, I might add. But Bitcoin soared to $60,000 a Bitcoin because the Fed's expansion was so extraordinary. Non-fungible tokens, NFTs, soared in value. Art soared in value, even as the contraction from the COVID pandemic was taking hold. But then, after about a year, the price increases went from the asset markets into the commodity markets. So we started to see increases of wheat prices, of other grain prices, of copper prices, of oil prices. And you could watch the monetary mechanism working its way through the system. First assets, then commodities, and by now into the core economy itself. That is wages and prices of non-commodity goods and services. So the inflation in the United States, nothing that Argentina would even notice. It's up to maybe around 8%. So you might say, my God, that's price stability. But in fact, from a US point of view, it's pretty unusually high. Europe has topped 10% in the Eurozone. And the result of the supply shocks on the one side, which have pushed up commodities and prices, especially of energy and food, and the monetary expansion on the other side, means a full-blown stagflation, as I mentioned, of the first time in the last 40 years. The Fed, to defend its position, now is raising interest rates significantly. The US economy is perhaps already in recession. As you know, we've had, on preliminary data, 2 negative quarters. So one could say a technical recession if the preliminary data hold up. The economy seems stronger than that for the moment, but the Fed is continuing to ratchet up interest rates, and the disruptions from the war and from the sanctions regime continue to operate. So I predict an outright US recession that goes along with the outright European recession. Now, it happens that China also is experiencing a sharp slowdown. Maybe even stronger words might apply. And this also needs to be looked at from many points of view. The United States is in an economic war with China. Have no doubt about it. And it's an awful mistake, in my opinion. But US policymakers are trying actively to harm the Chinese economy. I don't make the accusation lightly. I make it after a cascade of multiple deliberate injuries to the Chinese economy, starting with unilateral trade measures, then unilateral measures on financial flows, on foreign direct investment, both from China into the US market and from the US to the Chinese market, and most recently in restrictions on exports of US high technology, especially high-end semiconductors, to China. We also tried very hard to break major Chinese enterprises like Huawei and ZTE. This is part of a geopolitical game, but an extremely dangerous game. It is a US version of containment applied to China in the same way that the US once applied it to the Soviet Union. The Chinese don't like it very much, by the way. They don't like the #1 economy in the world saying quite explicitly, we are out to harm the #2 economy in the world. But that is absolutely what's happening. Now, that's also destroying supply chains, undermining confidence, and ratcheting up geopolitical tensions, especially across the Straits of Taiwan. So the US has a two-front war, economic war, one with Russia, one with China, and the disruptions of this war are worldwide. China's economy is definitely hurting from this, and because China's the main trade partner of much of the world, that percolates throughout the entire world. So if you added up the COVID shocks, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions regime, the geopolitical tensions, the tightening of credit by the Fed and the European Central Bank as a delayed response to the massive increase of liquidity in 2020, you have quite a brew. But it's not even limited to that, because there's one more major shock that is hitting the world, and that is the climate shocks that are being felt almost everywhere. And in 2022, almost in an uncanny way, major climate shocks being felt in all of the major regions of the world. The United States just had a massive hurricane, one of the worst landfalling hurricanes in U.S. modern history. The storm continues, but it made 2 landfalls with massive devastation in Florida and in North and South Carolina. We've had drought across Europe, massive failures of rains in Africa. We've had flooding more recently in Europe, massive drought in China, and heat waves and many other side effects of the climate shocks being felt around the world. Now, when you have such a complex concurrence of events, this is when diplomacy is absolutely vital. Many of those supply shocks, even COVID as it continues till today, especially the war, the geopolitical shocks, the management of the fallout from monetary tightening, which will hit dozens of countries trying to repay their debts, the tightening of global capital markets, all of this requires an active, cooperative approach by the major countries. It requires decisions within the International Monetary Fund to be on the liquidity lender of last resort side, to pay absolutely quick and urgent attention to countries in financial stress. It requires the bilateral creditor countries, China and European countries and the United States and others, to work together for recapitalizing debts coming due. It requires cooperation in the international development banks, especially the multilateral development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, which doesn't even have a leader right now, for heaven's sake, and in other venues, to make sure that there is public financing that can offset declines of private financing. In short, we need the G20 right now to acknowledge that this is the worst economic crisis, certainly since the early 1980s, and it could quickly dwarf that crisis because we have a very hot and very dangerous war underway right now, which we did not have in the late 1970s and the early 1980s in the same way. And so when you add it up, I think that this is the worst situation that we've experienced probably since the end of World War II in terms of dangers. We need cooperation to avoid a contagion of financial crises and to address the underlying sources of these crises, an approach to ending the war on a diplomatic basis, which incidentally could happen if the United States would finally recognize that its attempt to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia was a major provocation that led to this extraordinarily dangerous deterioration and the onset of war itself. We need cooperation to continue to push COVID to the end of this pandemic, because we're not done with this pandemic yet. We need the multilateral financial institutions to be acting with alacrity by making larger loans, helping countries to make major structural investments, for example, in green energy, because private capital markets will not make these investments right now. We need provision of liquidity so that countries don't get into debt distress because of contagion, which we know to be absolutely possible in moments like this. And we need to avoid further deterioration of relations between the US and China. It's a large order, and I have to tell you, I'm not very optimistic right now, because I don't see the political will for this despite the fact that all of the major regions are suffering economically. There's no one that is getting through this crisis well. Not the United States, not Europe, not China, certainly not Russia, nor the developing countries. There's no bright spot that says, oh, well, here's the silver lining. There's only a worldwide crisis that is at risk of getting out of control. So that's the backdrop, and this requires absolutely skilled macroeconomic management for Argentina and countries like Argentina, which actually do not have terrible fundamentals, but don't have any trust in the international capital markets. We need liquidity. We need routine recapitalization of debt. Argentina's trouble, incidentally, is its reputation, not its reality. If you looked at the fiscal balance sheets of the government of Argentina and the federal government of the United States, you'd rather have Argentina's balance sheet. It's got lower debts, it's got smaller deficits, but the fact of the matter is nobody trusts Argentina. And so even when it comes to very, very small amounts of refinancing, it's a crisis. That's what the international system needs to address. That is a market failure, by the way. That is a profound market failure. That's not normal. That is a market failure because our institutions do not address this kind of financial panic or self-fulfilling financial crisis, where a country has a bad reputation, therefore it can't borrow, therefore it has a bad reputation because it can't routinely refinance its debts. If you took away the name Argentina from Argentina's instruments and just showed the balance sheets, the fisc, and all the rest, it would be a pretty big yawn. No one would be too concerned. But since everybody always expects the worst, they often get the worst. And that's the problem that we need to overcome also, self-fulfilling crises. So this is a big mess of a situation. I wish the United States would get back to the business of business and out of the business of war and conflict. The world would be a lot safer. So thank you very much for letting me share these thoughts with you, and back over to you.